Cars and trucks have become the most important means of transportation for millions of people around the globe. We depend on our cars and trucks to take us to and from school and work, to run errands, visit friends, take vacations, and move goods from one place to another. The automobile industry is one of the biggest in the world. There are more than 530 million cars and trucks currently traveling the roads of the world. Have you ever wondered how the automobile became such an important form of transportation? Do you know how cars work? Have you ever thought of how they affect our lives? There was a time not so long ago when the fastest anybody traveled was at the speed of a horse. But horsepower was slow and unreliable. Then during the 1800s, the development of the steam-powered engine made it possible to go faster and farther on a railroad. The only problem was trains only went where the tracks took them. Inventors began to wonder, could a bulky steam engine be made small enough and light enough to power a carriage? In 1769, a French military engineer proved it could. He built the first self-propelled road vehicle called a horseless carriage. In 1801, an Englishman proved that a four-wheeled steam-driven car could carry passengers. But early steam cars never caught on because they were costly to maintain, they damaged roads, and they sometimes blew up. They also made a terrible noise, dirtied the air with smoke, and frightened horses. An American inventor named William Morrison had a better idea. He built an electric car. Morrison's six-passenger vehicle was powered by batteries under the seats. Electric cars quickly became popular because they were quiet, easy to operate, and free of smelly fumes. But they were not practical. Few electric cars could travel faster than 20 miles per hour or 32 kilometers per hour. And their batteries had to be recharged about every 50 miles or 80 kilometers. By the 1850s, inventors were looking for a better way to power horseless carriages. A Frenchman named Jean Lenoir came up with one. Cars and trucks might never have become a successful form of transportation if it hadn't been for his invention, the internal combustion engine. Jean-Joseph Etienne Lenoir patented the first successful internal combustion engine, also called a gasoline engine, in 1860. Lenoir's engine combined a mixture of gasoline and air inside closed cylinders, which produced power when it was burned. Do you know how a gasoline engine works? When your parents turn their car's ignition key, pistons inside the engine move up and down, sucking a mixture of air and fuel into the engine's cylinders. The pistons then compress the fuel and air just as an electric spark from the spark plug ignites it. This creates a small explosion inside the cylinder, and the explosion forces the piston to move. This process is repeated thousands of times a minute, producing the power it takes to move the car. But an engine alone can't move a car. It takes a crankshaft, a transmission, and a drive shaft to direct the engine's power. How do they work? The pistons are connected to the crankshaft. As the pistons move up and down, they spin the crankshaft. The crankshaft in turn is connected to the transmission, which takes the rotary movement of the crankshaft and transfers it to the drive shaft. The drive shaft is connected to the car's wheels. When the drive shaft spins, Gears at the end of the drive shaft spin the car's wheels, and the car moves. Once engineers combined these three elements with a steering mechanism that could turn a car in the direction the driver wanted it to go, the automobile was invented. Two German engineers, Gottlieb Daimler and Karl Benz, developed the first practical gasoline engine in 1885. But at that time, there were not very many places a car could go. It would take better roads and the introduction of the pneumatic tire before cars and trucks would become practical means of transportation. In 1895, a French rubber company introduced the first automobile tires filled with compressed air. These pneumatic tires were like bicycle tires and gave automobiles a much smoother ride. Before 1900, most automobiles were made in Europe. After 1900, America became the center for automobile production. There were about 5,000 cars in America at the time, and most of them were made by hand, one at a time. It was a costly and time-consuming business. That would change when mass production was introduced. The 1901 Oldsmobile is considered the first mass-produced car, but it was an American industrialist named Henry Ford who perfected the mass production process. In 1913, he installed a revolutionary moving assembly line in his factory near Detroit, Michigan. Ford's invention was simple. A chain pulled the frames of his cars through the plant, as workers assembled the car by adding parts that had been brought to them on conveyor belts. By 1916, Americans had built 1.5 million automobiles. When Ford introduced his famous Model T in 1908, it cost $825. After he put in the moving assembly line, production tripled to almost 250,000 Model Ts a year. In 1924, the price dropped to only $290, thanks to mass production. Just about anyone who had a job could afford a Model T. But Henry Ford wasn't the only one to mass-produce cars in Detroit. Many of the cars made today got their start in Detroit 100 years ago. Ransom E. Olds began to mass-produce his famous curved-dash Oldsmobile in 1899. Louis Chevrolet formed the Chevrolet Motor Company, whose low-priced car became an immediate success. David Dunbar Buick started the Buick Motor Company and was a top Detroit automaker by 1908. Walter P. Chrysler worked for Buick, then became vice president of General Motors, and then founded his own company in Detroit, the Chrysler Corporation. By the 1920s, auto production had become a pillar of the U.S. economy. By the end of the decade, American factories were churning out 5 million cars a year, making more money than any other industry. Automobiles were big business. It would be difficult to name any other invention, discovery, or technological advance that has affected our lives more than the automobile. Cars have given us all incredible freedom. They enable us to decide where we want to go and when. They influence where we live and work and how we spend our leisure time. It was because of the people who traveled in cars that the first motels were built in 1925. The first drive-in was created for people who didn't like getting out of their cars. The Pig Stand in Dallas, Texas became the first restaurant where people could drive in and eat without ever leaving their car. Then came drive-in movies, drive-through banks, and drive-up convenience stores. The automobile industry kept many other businesses alive too. Thousands of repair shops, filling stations, and parts stores. It also fed the industries that made tools and materials needed to build cars and trucks. As production increased, the demand for steel, rubber, glass, and other goods grew as well. Almost 1/5 of U.S. steel production today and nearly 3/5 of its rubber output goes to make cars. Cars and trucks use a great amount of fuel every day, which supports families who make their living from the oil industry. And many more people make their living building roads for cars and trucks to drive on. In 1916, the very way automobiles were sold changed America's buying habits and started the credit industry. Manufacturers of medium-priced cars had to compete with Henry Ford's low-priced Model T. To do so, they allowed their customers to pay for their automobiles over time, in several payments. Installment loans made expensive items affordable to average people. There is hardly a thing we do or a place we go that hasn't been affected by the automobile. Like everything new, when the horseless carriage was first introduced, not everyone liked the idea. Some people felt the first cars were too noisy, smelly, and dangerous. Others welcomed the new machines because they replaced horse-drawn carriages. Unsightly horse droppings no longer littered the streets, and their stench and the disease-bearing flies they attracted were gone. People no longer needed to feed and care for horses, and cars made their hometowns cleaner places. Automobiles even changed the very landscape. As American factories began churning out hundreds of thousands of cars and trucks in the 1920s, most roads were simply dirt paths. They were rough and bumpy and nearly impassable in rainy weather, and most of them were only built in cities. In 1926, the government undertook a plan to build a network of all-weather paved highways that would crisscross the United States and connect every city and town.
The need for first-class highways grows constantly as the automobile and the motor truck become increasingly important in both city and rural commerce.
They still haven't stopped building. And today, no matter where you look, chances are you'll see a road running somewhere along the landscape. When the first automobiles were produced, only the well-to-do could afford them. But before long, people who lived in the country became the first large-scale group of car owners. There were plenty of railroads and streetcars in the cities, but trucks now enabled rural farmers to bring their goods to market faster. Tractors helped them to run their farms more efficiently, and cars enabled them to travel more often. Soon people living in the country didn't feel so isolated from the rest of the world. Wherever people have easy access to automobiles, cars play a major role in social life and the choice of recreational activities. People People found it fun to hop in the car and visit friends and relatives, whether the drive takes a few minutes, hours, or days. As roads improved and car ownership expanded, this freedom enabled more and more people to move to the suburbs and get better jobs. By the mid-1950s, even factories had begun to relocate closer to the suburbs to accommodate their workers. Most of the conveniences we have taken for granted today probably wouldn't be here if it weren't for the automobile. While cars and trucks have given people the freedom to live, work, and travel wherever they want, they have also created some serious problems. Car accidents have become a major cause of death and injury. Exhaust fumes foul the air in many cities, and the roar of city traffic can be nerve-wracking. Each year, motor vehicle accidents kill about 300,000 people around the world, many of them young people. In the United States, traffic accidents are the leading cause of death for people from 5 to 32 years old. Young drivers have the highest accident rate of all because they often take unnecessary risks. Since cars and trucks burn gasoline and diesel oil, they also release hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, and nitrogen oxides. These all cause pollution, which endangers people's health and damages crops and livestock. Today, about 450 million cars and 80 million trucks travel the streets and highways of the world. They consume millions of barrels of crude oil, which cannot be replaced and will one day run out. The automobiles of tomorrow will be increasingly fuel efficient and may run on alternate energy sources like electricity and the heat of the sun. They will be much safer, less polluting, and probably even more popular than they are today.